Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the politics podcast that still doesn't quite dare to bet on a Labour victory next week. I'm Ros Taylor. On today's show, Keir Starmer said he believes in realistic hope. But what is realistic hope and why are we so short of it? The former chairman of YouGov and political commentator, Peter Kellner, joins us to talk about polls and 6 decades of general elections. And in the extra bit for supporters, what happens when someone you detest makes a good argument? The panel share their teeth-clenching moments. Let's meet that panel. First, it's Westminster editor for The Lead, Zoe Grünewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
The 11th junior doctor strike starts on Thursday. We seem to have become so used to these strikes that they barely register in the media. Why?
So I think the junior doctor strike lost a little bit of momentum when other healthcare professionals settled, did their pay settlements. So we know that the nurses finally managed to settle their pay dispute. And I think after that, just this sort of push that we felt from the public and from the media for these strikes to be resolved, I think slightly lessened. But I think there's also something about junior doctors striking or healthcare professionals striking compared to, say, train strikes, where you don't really feel the impact as acutely as, say, you're trying to get to work and all the trains are cancelled and everybody's working from home. You won't really feel the impact of junior doctors striking unless you have a cancelled medical appointment or you're waiting hours in A&E. And to be honest, those things are happening anyway. I think people don't necessarily associate them with immediate strike action. So I think that's kind of why we're not really talking about it as much. As you say, it's, the 11th doctor strike. I wasn't even sure how many there'd been. I mean, it does seem to have been rumbling on for a long time. And I think just with everything else going on, all the other sort of political news is just kind of slightly blended into the background now.
From next Friday, probably, this is going to be Wes Streeting's problem. How is he going to handle this dispute?
So he's been very keen to say he's going to try and get this settled as soon as possible. I think he said one of the first things he would do was to get on the phone to the BMA. But he has made it also very clear that the demands of a 35% pay rise he deems unaffordable, and Labour won't be committing to that. But I think there's something really interesting about this, which is that Labour kind of does need immediate political wins as soon as it gets into office. It needs to show to the rest of its members that it has momentum, but it also needs to show that it's functioning and the public did a good gamble when they bet on them. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if actually Labour make this kind of their priority to try and resolve this as soon as possible. And the other thing to say is, the public tend to trust Labour more with the NHS than the Tories. There's probably likely to be a bit more public pressure on the junior doctor side of things to resolve as well. So I think we can imagine that when Labour do form a government, this is going to be a kind of immediate priority and hopefully will be resolved quite quickly.
Yeah. If any listeners haven't yet seen the Channel 4 dispatches on the A&E at Royal Shrewsbury, it is a really, really harrowing watch, but I urge you to watch it nonetheless. It's just incredibly powerful. I spent most of my time crying through it. Next up, it's Guardian columnist and author Rafael Behr. Hi, Raf.
Hi, Ros.
The betting scandal. It isn't going away. How much does this really matter?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's worth drawing quite an important distinction between the practice of taking inside information to a bookies and gaming the system because you can work the odds to your favour, essentially guaranteeing yourself a payout, which is cheating and a criminal offence, and just betting on politics because you know a bit about it and you like to have a flutter. And this scandal has kind of evolved and mutated in the way that these things often do, so that although the initial charge was very much about the small number of people who knew the exact date of the election and could exploit that information for gain, to now sort of anyone who seems to have bet on elections, including the Labour candidate who has been disowned by Keir Starmer, who bet against himself to win. Now the question then is, is it right that now this has become a sort of a catch-all, a sort of recoil sense of mass opprobrium for gambling on politics by politicians? I mean, my sense is that's probably taking it a bit too far. It's sort of the scandal has inflated a bit to fill the gap where there isn't maybe other election news, but also I think it resonates a lot because it lands against this broader backdrop of mistrust of politics, low esteem for politicians, and the sense that their first interest is always their pocket, and that so it kind of against the wider context of the government that we've just had from Boris Johnson, in particular, Partygate, but also there's PPE procurement scandals, which have quite relatively high salience. I found just a sense that it all just looks a bit grubby from afar, and in that sense, I think it is actually big and will have an impact.
And a kind of a fitting end to the administration as well, in some ways.
Yeah, it feels emblematic, that the campaign should slither and slide down towards the drain in this way. It says it was always swirling towards that way, and then the final sound of the kind of the chain being pulled as the Tories get flushed away is, a few betting slips going down the bog with them. Do you know what I mean? It has that slight vibe.
Yeah, that does sound like a good time. And finally, our guest this week has been voting in general elections since 1964, I believe. Peter Kellner is an award-winning journalist and pollster. He was the chairman of YouGov between 2001 and 2007 before going on to be its president until 2016. He's also written for The Times, The Observer, The New Statesman, among others. Hi, Peter.
Hi, and let me just say, had there been votes at 18, I would have been just old enough to vote in 1964, but they didn't change the voting age to the late 60s. So I missed out on 2 general elections, and I've never really recovered from that youthful, harrowing experience.
Yeah, I can sympathise. I also missed out on 1992 by a very small margin. How are you going to prepare for it?
When I used to do election nights in the BBC studio, I did 5 of them with David Dimbleby over 20-odd years. There was a heck of a lot of preparation and rehearsal and learning. I'm afraid I've decided I'm too long in the tooth to do that. So I will not be mugging up on 100 key constituencies. It will be broad brush and burrowing into my long and occasionally accurate memory.
And how about afterwards? How do you generally recover from a general election? Long sleep in or straight up in the morning at usual time?
Well, normally, as this time, I'll be writing for the Sunday Times after I've been writing through this election for the Sunday Times, and I'll carry on through to the Sunday afterwards. So from about Saturday afternoon onwards, I'll be able to relax and drink.
No rest. Before we start, more excitement for election night. You know about our sold-out live show at the Tabernacle in London. You know about the live stream for Patreon people from 8:30 to 10:30. Sign up for Patreon, link in the show notes. But what about afterwards? What happens into the small hours as the results start to come in and we see what the new government is really going to be like? And who gets Portilloed? We have the perfect thing for your long night in front of the TV. We can announce that a mix of Oh God What Now regulars and friends of the pod will be streaming live on YouTube all night long from 10 p.m. into the small hours. We'll be watching and commenting on all the results, just like a mix of Gogglebox and Jeff Stelling's Soccer Saturday. And it's free. All you need to do is follow our YouTube channel and fire up the app as the results start to come in. That's Oh God What Now, your second screen companion for the biggest night in British politics of the decade. Sign up now, link in the show notes, and we will see you there. We're up all night to get Rishi. This is a strange election in many ways, but maybe the strangest is the way Labour talks about hope. 2024 is one of the most cynical elections that I can remember. We all suspected, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies agrees, that the sums in the manifestos don't necessarily add up, and public services are going to continue to be awful for quite a long time. So Labour talks a lot about restoring hope, but what does that mean, and will it survive the next few months and years? Raf, Keir Starmer told the FT, people need hope, but it has to be ordinary hope, realistic hope, possibly the most Keir Starmer-ish thing he's ever said. This is not exactly the I have a dream brand of political oratory, is it?
No, and I think it expresses 2 very important things to understand about Keir Starmer's Labour Party and the political project he has created. The first is about his temperament, his character. I mean, that's who he is. He is a barrister who assembles a case very methodically. He is a public servant who adapts to evidence and does institutional reform in a very methodical, piecemeal way. He's not someone given to great flights of rhetorical fancy, and I think is intuitively suspicious of them. But also it reflects a strategic judgment that the Labour Party has made based on listening to what voters have been telling them, and based on what the sort of the focus groups that Deborah Mattinson, his sort of one of his key strategists, has been conducting for a long time, which is a recognition that the whole currency of very ambitious, big, grandiose promises and pledges is debased. People do not trust that stuff, and if he were, and this is something that I think people on the left struggle to understand because they're so desperate to have the sort of the advantage that Keir Starmer has in opinion polls, combined with an extremely radical utopian message that socialism is coming and all the bad things are going to go away. And unfortunately, you just don't get those two things at the same time. And you certainly don't get them in this election. And partly that's because we already had a big utopian revolutionary project, which was Brexit. And you had a very ebullient, effective evangelical leader for that project in the form of Boris Johnson. And he turned out to be a massive charlatan, a crook and a liar. And so there just isn't the space, there isn't the bandwidth in politics now for Keir Starmer to come along and go, I know a lot of you people put your hopes in this big revolutionary thing that was going to change everything and make everything better. And that was a bit of a dud. But sorry, wrong revolution. Now we're going to just have another revolution and everything's going to be great and wonderful. He knows that no one will believe you, but no one will believe him if he said that. And he has to, and he's absolutely committed to, as he will, and his aides will always say, under promise, over deliver. And so that's where this is coming from. And I think it's probably the right strategic judgment. But the danger is that, he and people around him, I think, maybe underestimating the requirement for some kind of sugary, snacky flavour early on to make people feel that they've got something for their Labour government.
Yes, because isn't it a PM's job, or part of a PM's job, to give people hope? Or is governing well the best that he can reasonably do?
Yeah, I think, again, I would say I think he is underestimating perhaps the extent to which the performance didactic element of it, bringing people with you, explaining what you're doing and making them feel there's a real emotional purpose to this, doesn't end when the campaign ends. And just thinking, some of the language you get from the people around Keir Starmer is very much this expectation that when the relief of having a good, competent government with ministers who exude some kind of integrity and aren't just these awful, horrendous, dreadful Tories that we've got so used to, that relief at that, the release from Conservative government will buy them sufficient honeymoon, and then they can start demonstrating they're doing things. I'm not sure there is that level of patience and capacity, and the fact that he doesn't have that evangelical gear will, I think, start to be a problem perhaps sooner than they realise.
Sorry, was there a point during the last 14 years when the Conservatives have offered people hope? What did it look like?
Well, clearly Brexit was a beacon of hope for some people. And we saw that because, a large proportion of people voted for it, and they were placing a lot of hope that things would improve, that inequality would be reduced, that Britain would start building and producing again, that there would be more wealth trickling down, that there would be more housing, that there would be better public services. All of that they put onto Brexit. I'd also say 2019, clearly there was a lot of people putting their support behind Boris Johnson because they hoped in some way he might be able to end the sort of Brexit deadlock. Whether that was hope or, kind of what we're seeing now, which is exhaustion with the status quo, I don't know. And actually the two are very kind of intertwined. But I think probably, the time we saw that hope most apparently was Brexit. That was a real referendum of hope. And, half the population were really upset by it and disparaged by it and knew it wasn't going to work. But there was a large proportion of people who did. And it's like, people want to get behind an idea or something. There has to be a magic bullet to make things feel better. And I think part of the problem, that Raf was talking about with Keir Starmer is that he's not offering a magic bullet. He's not saying everything will be okay if we just do this. He's saying there's going to be tough decisions. It's going to take a while. It's going to be a bit rubbish. Lots and lots of caveats. And I think that's why people don't like that answer. They want to feel like there's obviously something really simple that's missing that the government can provide. And I don't think that's true.
Hope is a lot vaguer than trust, which is also being talked about a lot in this election. Does the one have to come before the other?
I think it's hard to have hope if you don't have trust in the government, because you need to have you need to believe that they are going to do the things they say they are, and you need to believe that they have good intentions. For Labour, where trust is broken, there's a lack of trust in Starmer, partly because of his track record, his tearing up of the 2019 manifesto. There's a lack of faith in Labour. People talk about Corbyn years, and they talk about, the recovery from the financial crash. There's all of these kind of things that are said about Labour that people don't trust. But then there's also the lack of faith and trust in politicians generally. And this is where all these Conservative scandals and all this sleaze isn't just a problem for the Conservatives, it's a problem for Labour as well, because people don't necessarily differentiate between the two. They think Westminster is a swamp, and they think everybody has kind of got their hand in the till, and the Conservatives maybe have had more scrutiny because they're the governing party, but I don't think people necessarily differentiate between the two. I think, with Labour, clearly, and I agree with Ralph, I don't think there is a lot of patience. I think they're gonna have to do things quite quickly because, right now they know that they've sort of tentatively got the media on the side, they've tentatively got the public on the side. The public they want a change in the status quo. They don't like how things are going, but they're going to need some quick wins, and they're going to need some evidence that their policies have worked. And I think, clearly there's been hope and trust have been dashed, and currently people are just hopeful that whatever comes is going to be better than what was there before, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have trust in the Labour Party.
And a lot of people are hoping that Starmer is a lot more radical than he appears, not least a lot of people voting Lib Dem and Green, for example. As Raf said, under-promising so he can over-deliver. Do you think that's part, there are people who say, he'll get into power and he'll do a great deal more than he promised or that we expected. Are you one of those people?
I'm one of those people, yeah, quite unashamedly. I mean, people say, what do they say? You're huffing copium when you say, actually, I think the Labour Party might be more progressive than it's letting on. And, we do know that Labour has to do this dance with the media and with the Tories and with the public to kind of fudge some of their positions and stay fairly central and get those voters, because we know that parties win when they take the middle ground. But I think the problem a lot of people are seeing, and it's, we're talking about it a lot, that none of the parties are being particularly truthful when it comes to public finances, is that there is a sort of lack of radicalism around the economy, around taxation, and it kind of looks a bit like Labour's sticking their head in the sand. I think people know that the Tories are slightly delusional when it comes to fixing the economy. I mean, we literally saw that play out with Liz Truss, and they are set on lowering taxes. People no longer trust them to fix public services. I think they kind of think that's that they're not interested in that. But with Labour, I think a lot of voters now are saying it just doesn't seem to add up. Like, how can we go on as we are? How can you not promise anything radical and we're supposed to expect that the NHS will suddenly be fixed? And so I think people are, we know that Labour's not being truthful there, and Labour know we know, and I think that's what's making people feel like, well, someone like me is making me think that they might have more in their trunk. And we do know, I mean, The Guardian reported, I think last week, that Labour is drawing up what could be proposals or options for some sort of wealth tax and looking at alternative ways that they can, raise more funds, whether it's through a reassessment of council tax bans or wealth taxes or whatever. And we've seen it in their language. There is priming around, well, when we get into office, we just don't know what the books are going to look like. So I feel like there are hints there. And really cynical people would say, oh, they're just hints to keep progressives like you on side. But I don't know. I think, there are strong and smart people in that shadow cabinet, and I would believe that they would be looking at all available options to try and save public services.
Peter, hope is a pretty powerless word. It hints that it's all you've got left. Do you think that's how voters really feel at the moment?
I think there's a lot of disillusion, and a large part of the disillusion is that the outgoing government, and it will be gone in 8 days' time, 9 days' time, is that it has basically been saying to the electorate, things have been difficult, but we've been taking the right action. You can trust us, got a good hand on the tiller, and we'll carry on doing what we are now doing. And this is not a time when this particular form of continuity has much appeal. I'm not sure I completely agree with what Zoe said, because Politicians need to give voters hope, but hope can only be believed if people think you're being honest about the present situation. And I think Keir Starmer, if he's got an inner Churchill, should summon it up. This is a time for blood, toil, tears and sweat. I think you can only sell the project of the distant sunlit uplands if you're also honest about the rockiness of the path immediately in front of you. I think those two things go together. And what I hope, leaving aside policies, rhetorically, I hope Keir Starmer in the first weeks before we break up for the August holidays, which the politicians will deserve more than most, is he will say something along the lines of, we've opened the books, it's much tougher than we thought, we're going to have to take some really serious action. He's got to create a narrative where he downplays what people expect in the short term, and with that buys some credibility about the nature of the long-term projects and the long-term improvements.
It's interesting what you said. I mean, does he also need to create, echoing Churchill, I suppose, a sense that people are part of the solution and are not just passive recipients of whatever the government chooses to do? Because that seems to me to be one of the key problems at the moment, that it has to be, everyone has to pull together, needs to be the mood, because at the moment people feel that government is just screwing them over.
Oh, absolutely. And if I can extend the Churchill metaphor, of course, he was wildly popular as a war leader, but wildly unpopular in terms of the domestic agenda. So during the Second World War, there was all this ferment of activity, especially as your picture post, your beverage, the 1944 Education Act. Churchill wasn't interested in any of that. But that was the domestic agenda that captured the imagination. And so Labour won the 1945 election. So, yes, absolutely, Starmer has got to have an exciting agenda with very little money, which is why he's got to sell this as a long-term project, not short-term achievements. And therefore, he's got to carry people, a narrative that carries people first, the first 3 or 4 years, when frankly, not much is going to be achieved in terms of day-to-day life.
How much of the opposite of hope, despair, do you see in the polling and in focus groups especially?
I think despair's overstating it. I think there was despair essentially until the election was called, because then once the election was called, there was a pretty imminent prospect of a change of government. And I agree, I think, I can't remember if it was Zoe or Raf said earlier, Starmer's ratings are not that great. This will be a big Labour this will be much more a big Tory defeat than a big Labour victory. Of course, in numbers, it's a big Labour victory. But the substance of this, Labour could well have a landslide victory with less than 40% of the vote. It'll be could be a very peculiar result. There'll be a lot of questions about the nature of Labour's mandate. And it's another reason why, in a sense, Starmer has got to carry on campaigning to get public approval beyond the election. He's going to have to change the nature of the campaigning. It's no longer knocking the Tories. His enemy after the election will not be the Tories. It will to some extent be unrealistic hopes of people who think things must get better in the next year or two or I'll give up. He's got, as I say, at the risk of repeating myself, he's got to sell to the public a 10-year project. And he's talked about 10 years to change Britain, but I'm not sure people have quite grasped that he actually means that you're not going to see the big improvements in whether it's on child poverty or health or education or whatever. It's going to take the bulk of the first term to even start properly achieving any of these things. And unless he makes it clear from the outset the how long this will take, then he risks disillusion setting in pretty early. And although people say if it's a Labour landslide, they're bound to get 2 terms, well, my response is, well, if you get a turnover of 200, 250 seats in one election, you can have the opposite turnover in the next election. And this is why I think it's important that Labour recognises that its apparent landslide is not built on a landslide. It's a landslide in seats, but by no means in a popular vote. And therefore, Labour could be vulnerable 2 or 3 years into the coming Parliament unless it's established from the outset as with the terms of engagement over the next decade.
So all that said, we're in it for the long haul. It's going to take time, which is absolutely true. Raf, hope does need some sustenance. What can Labour plausibly do to sort of sustain it a bit in the next few months and the rest of this year?
Well, I mean, Zoe mentioned trying to get a quick win on the doctor's strike. And I do think the NHS will be a clear point of focus in order to just deliver something that you can say measurably, sort of some measurable progress. Whether you sort of settle with the junior doctors, you ramp up the kind of overtime, out of hours provision, you just hammer away at the waiting list, so you can reach later in the autumn and say, look, this is what the graph of waiting lists now looks like, and actually people are getting their operations. It will be very hard. They might get lucky in terms of mortgage rates. If interest rates come down, this is what Rishi Sunak was slightly hoping would happen in time for him. I mean, it's part of his weird calculation about when he called the election. But inflation is now broadly under control, so interest rates could come down. I think there might be a bit of a bonus in terms of tax receipts actually coming in quite high. I mean, there's been so much sort of confected nonsense argued about tax during this election campaign, but the big picture is, a lot of people have been dragged into a higher rate of paying tax just but through inflation, and actually that means in headline terms the receipts aren't so bad, and there might be some headroom there in an emergency budget. But no, I think Peter's absolutely right. There will have to be an articulation of the project in terms that defers gratification, and Keir Starmer has used some of this language. He's sort of denounced sticking plaster politics and said, he's not in the business of just sort of complaining and protest. His mission driven. It's all about sort of serious change for the long term. And I don't have huge expectations that he'll find a better sort of performance persona for selling this and deferring gratification in those terms. I do think, though, and we're seeing a little bit of it now towards the end of the campaign, he will suddenly emerge as a more confident figure. I think, particularly in the run-ups to the election, because you are going against the sort of very, very strong headwinds, media headwinds, and the sort of just any institutional apparatus that hammers Labour in opposition. Once they've actually won and proved that the system's worked, and they've got a big majority, and they can start really controlling the narrative a bit better through a King's Speech, through legislation. The sense of sort of Starmer's shoulders dropping a little bit and his chest coming out a little bit, of his voice dropping in, not having that kind of slightly edgy supply teacher voice that he has about the classroom that's not quite under control, and having a bit more natural authority, which is actually what recommended him to a lot of people years and years ago, when people were saying, they keep an eye on that guy, he's going to be prime minister one day, which they were. And then that sort of disappeared for a while, and people thought, really, that guy? I'm not sure. He sounds a bit, squeaky and weird. You might see that Keir Starmer come back, and then that will actually be quite a significant change for words in terms of how people understand what they've got in this government.
Now, let's have a couple of questions from our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too can submit a question to the panel. Keep sending them in, they always challenge us. First this week is a question from Jerry Redmond, who asks, is Michael Gove more dangerous now he is no longer an MP? He was subject to scrutiny, a little, in Parliament, and managed to build a reputation as a Machiavellian character. As his connections to Tufton Street and Murdoch are well known, what does the panel think he will get up to now the eyes of the country are no longer on him? Peter, what do you reckon? Michael Gove, what's his future?
Gosh, Michael Gove, I mean, he's like the tarantula on the back of the frog in the river. I mean, he can't help himself. I'm sure he will be a threat. I'm not quite sure who he will be a threat to. And I'm not quite sure that he knows who he'll be a threat to, because he can't help himself. Give me a bit longer to ponder that while maybe Raf has a go. But that's my initial response to your question.
Yeah, I think he is undoubtedly one of the most interesting and complex figures of British politics for the last decade. And what I've always found slightly intriguing about Michael Gove is he's a very clever, thoughtful, and articulate person. And it's unlike Boris Johnson, I think is entirely unprincipled as a human being. He just believes in nothing apart from his own advancement. I think Michael Gove sort of passionately believes whatever it is he is saying at that particular moment, and then deploys his intellect towards the sort of justification of a position he needs to take in the expedient pursuit of his ambition as well, which is a subtle difference. He actually believes it while he's saying it, and he can articulate it very well. I think, so two additional points that follow from that. I think certainly the fact that he was on the Times, was accompanied Rupert Murdoch when he went to visit Donald Trump. It will, has a journalistic writer's instinct for influence and power without responsibility. I think some role maybe at the Times is something that the people could keep an eye out for. The Times editorship changes from time to time. George Osborne went to edit the Standard, so there's a precedent there. So that's one thought.
And look how that's ended up.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it can't happen again. And I mean, the other thing, in ideological terms, I think it will be very interesting if there's going to be a sort of a battle for the soul of the Conservative Party, although soul is a strong word in that context. And it's kind of a sort of a post-Cameron stabilisation. Where's the centre? Is there a centre-right liberal thing, guardrail that can be re-established there? Or is the future much more kind of from sort of MAGA American Republican model with a bit of Orbanism, Farage, the sort of new radical populist right thing, which seems to be the insurgent energy? Where will Michael Gove actually jump on that? And where will that capacity that I described that he has to apply his formidable loquacity and intellect to the justification of whichever side he thinks might suit him at that particular moment, where will that point him? And I genuinely can't call that, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, he's no stranger to Trump, is he? He's interviewed him and yeah. Anyway, Zoe, what do you reckon? Is he going back to the Times?
I think that's quite a good shout, actually. I mean, what's really interesting about Michael Gove is I think he is in some ways, or likes to think of himself in some ways, as a bit of a kingmaker, and he is very sort of closely aligned, or was very closely aligned, to Kemi Badenoch. And I wonder, I mean, it's interesting kind of where he falls in the sort of battle for what the Conservative Party looks like, because some people see him as actually almost quite a sort of progressive conservative. He's really big on kind of building houses, and he wants to bring the Conservative Party back to the younger vote. But then also he's kind of backed or has endorsed this very culture war focused leader in Kemi Badenoch. So yeah, I think Raf is completely right. It's almost impossible to figure out what he'll do next, because he hasn't been consistent in how he's acted, and I don't know, to be honest. I think but he's definitely an interesting one to watch out for, and I'm sure he'll still be very relevant as the Conservative Party finds what it's going to do.
If I may, can I just add, having a bit more time to reflect, I hope he doesn't go to the Times, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I think the Times has had a rather good election. I think its coverage, its analysis, its commentaries, its commentators, it's been, across the field. It has reflected all points of view. It hasn't been a player in the election in the way that the Telegraph has been a player. If Michael Gove were to edit a paper, the paper he should edit is the Telegraph, not the Times, because because then he could be a real, an active and influential player in the future of the Conservative Party, as Raf was talking about. I think it would be just terrible for the Times. Maybe great for Michael Gove. I think it would be terrible for the Times if he went to the Times and turned it in to a Telegraph-style player in the Tories' post-election melodrama.
So, Jerry, we don't know, but we're watching him with a great deal of interest. Next is Tom from Norwich, who has sent us this question. We know Keir needs to campaign all out just to win, but if he/we could choose, do you think there is such a thing as too much majority? Does a small majority instill party discipline while a large one risks the rise of backbench rebellions? Is the country better off with an effective Tory opposition? Now, we're not going to use the word supermajority because it's very misleading, as we know, but what are our thoughts? Do we want there to be more than just an incredibly basic rump of Tories? Or, I mean, could there even be a Lib Dems in opposition? Is that preferable?
Well, shall I start on this? A very large majority, I think it matters in terms of the opposition much more than the government, because I think it does matter that we have a Tory party that's big enough and strong enough, to have enough sparky opposition frontbenchers in the Commons. And if you're down to sort of 80 or 90 MPs, you just won't have the numbers to do that. And also to see off reform, which I think has to be the main job of the Tory party post-election. But the other day I was talking to one of the senior players in the Blair government, and when they would nod at the time to the risks of a big majority, because that people said, and he said, actually, it's not true. If you're in government, the bigger the majority, the better. It means you can basically ignore backbench revolts. You've got a bigger pool of talents to draw upon. He said, from the practical business of doing government, there's no such thing as a majority that's too big. You may disagree with that, but I passed that on. It was said to me with somebody with great experience and with real feeling about the issue.
I also feel that, the country is in a state where actually it could really benefit from having a very strong government and a very strong majority. So, we saw that Rishi Sunak, although he had a majority, was absolutely hampered by the fact that none of his MPs really stood behind him. He wasn't able to get his planning reforms through. He spent months negotiating over the Rwanda legislation. And apart from that, I can't really point to very much else that Rishi Sunak brought forward. Boris Johnson, came in 2019 and he managed to put an end to the Brexit deadlock, which, you can totally disagree with his methods, as I'm sure we all do on this podcast. But, he did break through that. There are benefits, as Peter was saying, to having a large majority. And I think in a time where Labour is probably going to have to push through some quite unpopular and quite difficult things, probably in the form of tax rises, tax reforms, planning reforms, actually having a large majority is a real benefit and a real strength to them. And I think actually it's quite helpful. I mean, there's this thing that said that actually having a large majority can inspire rebellion because people, MPs get bored sitting on the back benches. They want ministerial positions and you have less to offer them. In some ways, actually, when you have a huge group of MPs to pick from, you'd expect the best people to rise to the top, and actually people have to work harder to be noticed. Whereas by the time we got to the last days of Sunak, almost everybody had been a housing minister. There's that kind of argument as well. So actually, I think in some ways a large majority can be very helpful, and we can overstate the dangers of a small majority.
Plus, being an MP should be a full-time job. I can't help feeling that it can well be a full-time job if you put a mind to it. Raf, you were saying.
Well, yeah, I think the one thing I would add to what Zoe just said is that also bear in mind that the Starmer operation has been very ruthless in terms of candidate selection. Now, if they have like hundreds of MPs, inevitably someone in there is going to turn out to be the source of some horrendous scandal before too long. I mean, it just becomes a sort of statistical certainty that someone's going to end up doing something disgraceful. But it is remarkable how much focus went into making sure there is a serious legion of Starmerite ultras in that parliamentary party, which will make a big difference. And while it is true that a very large majority tends to generate its own opposition because there's just something about the laws of political gravity that means some of those Labour MPs are going to find something to be angry about. And, I think there will be an element of that. I think a lot of, you've got a generation of Labour that is very much used to complaining about the government, and especially through the whole austerity period, being on the feeling on the right side of arguments about the schools being run down, hospitals closing. When you are the one voting for the hospital closure or the starving of resources, it is going to be very hard for those MPs, and they're not going to like their post bag. They're not going to be used to it. On top of that, I think if you look at what's been happening just at local level, local elections. And I think we'll get a stronger flavour of this next Thursday or next Friday morning. The capacity for the Greens to start doing a little bit to Labour what the Lib Dems did after the Iraq War in becoming this quite annoying, from a sort of whip's point of view, pressure points pulling from the left, making Labour MPs uncomfortable, threatening another kind of Bristol Central scenario. That will start to show. So there'll be all sorts of interesting dynamics that have been irrelevant to politics for the last 10 years that will suddenly come back. And one thing that I would just say in terms of the Conservative Party, I happen to take the view that there is a point at which it becomes dangerous when the Conservative Party is too small. Now, the Conservative Party, I don't like the right-wing hard right of the Conservative Party. And I think it's basically shades too much into reform. And I very much don't like what reform represents in terms of unrealistic, nasty populism and nativism. But I do think the Conservative Party also has another wing, a liberal centre-right wing, that is debilitated at the moment, but can function as a kind of guardrail in terms of the normal legitimate bounds of healthy democracy, focused on what could actually work in government. And if you completely flatten the Conservative Party, you are removing a very important institutional barrier on the right side of politics that stops some very, very dangerous, ugly, bad, paranoid, conspiracy theory driven, Putin friendly shit coming in, frankly. And so I would prefer to see something a little bit more like a kind of 1997 style whopping defeat for the Conservative Party, not quite like the Canada style total annihilation.
Next up, we're talking to Peter Kellner, former politics editor, BBC Newsnight reporter and award-winning pollster. Peter, so many polls in this campaign, so many. Are there just too many of them now?
Absolutely not. No, the more the merrier. And that's not just because I want more jobs for my old friends. There's a serious statistical point. Every poll, however well conducted, is subject to a margin of error. And there are also disputes about different ways of measuring public opinion. As you can see, that some polls have consistently bigger Labour leads than other polls. And the more polls you have, the easier it is to iron out the wrinkles in the polls. What I've been doing through the election, I've been comparing the same group. I think there are nine polls. Well, there are many more than 9 polls. There's something like 15 or 16 pollsters now. But there have been 9 that have been polling at least once a week since before the election was called. And what I've done is done a 9-poll week-by-week average. So I'm comparing absolutely like with like. And then what you find is all the stories you'll be getting of leads going up or down or whatever, you average them out and nothing like that's happening. There has been a small drop in Labour support since the election was called, a small drop in Conservative support, a bit of a rise in Lib Dem, a slightly bigger rise in Reform, which may now have come to an end. But you can't be sure with if you have any 1 or 2 or 3 polls, as we used to have, then you could never tell whether, if a party was up 3 points or down 3 points, whether that was real or simply just random sampling fluctuation. Now, the very large number of data points, to use sort of statistical terminology, the number of data points allows you much faster and more precisely to tell you whether things are going up or down. Paradoxically, while we can measure whether things are going up or down each week, I think with some certainty, we're much less certain about the levels of Labour or Tory or Reform or Lib Dem support, because we don't know, none of us really know, whether the polls like Opinion, like JL Partners, like More in Common, which tend to produce Labour leads of 16, 17, 18% normally, whether they've got it right because of the way they look at the don't knows and so on, all the adjustments they make to their raw data, whether they're getting it right or whether the pollsters like YouGov or Delta Poll, which are producing 23, 24, 25% leads, whether they're right. So we can't be sure what the level is until after the election, but we can be sure week by week what the changes are.
And it will be fascinating to find out, I imagine, especially for you, which one is the right method. We don't just have ordinary opinion polls either. We have MRPs as well. Tell us what MRPs do just briefly, because it's a bit complicated.
Right. It stands for multi-level regression post-stratification. I'll test you on this later. What it is a sort of a statistical box of tricks made possible by the very heavy-duty computers. And they have very large samples, typically around 20,000. YouGov would be going to 40 to 50,000. Why such large samples? Because what they're trying to do is break the electorate down into tiny demographic groups. If you want to know what women with young children who have one foreign holiday a year and there are two in a household, they've got a mortgage, sort of thing, and break society down into lots and lots and lots of detailed demographic groups. And then what it does is then it takes that data and relates it to the demographics of each constituency. And as a result, tries to project each constituency. Let me simplify this with a very clear example from the first election when MRP polls came in, which was in YouGov in 2017. And midway through the election, they produced a poll which said it was going to be a hung parliament. And everybody mocked it and said MRP is rubbish. The reason why it said correctly be hung parliament was because its overall figures showed a very narrow Tory lead. But the thing within that caught a lot of attention was the poll said Labour, for the first time ever, might win Canterbury. And, I went on, Ian Dale on LBC interviewed me and he said, come on, this is just rubbish. It's ridiculous to suppose Canterbury will fall. This shows this method is just a load of nonsense. Well, Labour did take Canterbury very early. Why did MRP get it right? Because one of the things it found in the data that in that election, the first election when Corbyn was leader, there was a massive swing to Labour amongst students. This was the early Corbyn effect. Canterbury is not a very large town or city. It has 2 universities. It has a great many students. So this was an example of MRP telling us something about a locality that you couldn't reasonably work out from conventional national polls. Now, against that, so that's the plus of MRP. The minus is this, that it can't tell you about very specific local factors. If an MP has a particular personal following, or indeed an animus against him or her, whether there's some local controversy in which the call up the election over the fate of a local hospital, or whether the local council has done something which people hate, there's always a lot of variation which MRP can't capture because they are constituency specific. And if you talk to people in the parties, I think they sometimes overstate constituency specific factors, but they are there to a degree. So I take with some caution those lists of individual seats. You can look up, all the companies that have done MRP. You look at what they say will happen in Stratford-on-Avon or in Hove or in Biggleswade or whatever. I would take those individual forecasts with a bit of a pinch of salt. But if they've got the basic algorithm right, they're probably pretty close on the overall numbers. But once again, as with ordinary polls, which produce a variation, different MRP companies, last week I think it was, or was it the week before? I think within 24 hours, one MRP poll said the Tories would be down to 53 seats. Another MRP poll said there'd be 155. Well, that's because they're using different algorithms. The sort of black box at the heart of the computer is set up differently, and we're not going to be sure until after the election, which on this occasion has had the better or the best black box.
Do we have any idea what proportion of people will vote tactically at this election?
Well, there are attempts that have been made, both directly by asking people about their willingness to vote to get the Tories out rather than form the party they want, and inferentially. The real problem is that let me oversimplify. There are broadly two kinds of tactical voter. There are those who are pretty sophisticated, who are pretty sure they're Labour or pretty sure they're Lib Dem all the time, but they realise that in this particular seat they need to vote for the other anti-Tory party because they're well aware of what the situation is. That's one sort. There's another sort of so-called tactical voter, people who are essentially just anti-Tory. They might have been Tory long ago, they might never have been Tory, but they're not particularly strongly pro-Labour or Lib Dem or Green or whatever. They simply want to get the Tories out. And they may not be following the detail very closely. Remember, we've had boundary changes, so that complicates it. So a lot of people will make up their minds who to vote for very late on, in the last 3 or 4 days. It may even be that even the last polls don't completely capture tactical voting. We can be sure there will be a lot of it. How do we know? Apart from polls saying so, it's because in the local elections last month, there was a lot of tactical voting. And if you look at the by-elections of the last couple of years, the Tories have lost a lot of seats. Something really curious happened. With one exception, in every one of those seats, the Lib Dems, they either won the seat or they got less than 10%. People knew where to vote Lib Dem and where to vote Labour. And although this has happened in the past, even in the 90s, when there was quite a lot of by-election tactical voting, it wasn't on the same scale of switching between Labour and Lib Dem as we've seen in the last couple of years. And so, I think tactical voting is bound to be on at least the scale it was in 1997, when it's been estimated the Tories lost around 30 seats more than they would have done without tactical voting, 20 to Labour, 10 to Lib Dem. These are broad brush estimates, they're not very precise. But it may be considerably more than that. And we won't really know until after the election, because we know about the first lot of tactical voters, but it's that second lot that may surprise us one way or the other.
One of the things that I agree with you. I love nerdy data, and the more the merrier from that point of view. But the one slight concern I have about watching this campaign and feeling it's a little bit overpolled is the way in which the polling has become the story. And then that ceases to be an observation about the campaign and becomes an actor within the campaign. And I wonder whether you think this will have an impact. For example, I live in Brighton Pavilion constituency. My sense is that this is exactly the sort of place that's more likely to go green, precisely because people are looking at the polls thinking there's no danger of the Tories getting in. It's safe to for the Brighton's leftists who feel a bit squeamish about Starmer's Labour Party to sort of to have a nice warm green bath by voting for Caroline Lucas's successor, as would be. And there might be other seats where that's the case. Or, in fact, there might be people who will be drawn back to the Conservatives. They think, well, steady on, we don't want a total annihilation. So are the polls now sort of meddling in the process with the prominence that they get and the sheer number of them?
Well, I let me not talk about meddling in the process, but as it were, trying to make it a more neutral question. Could they influence behaviour? Absolutely. For example, and this is one of the things I've been sort of pondering, it might be that Labour will suffer because a lot of people were willing to vote Labour because they were so anxious to kick out the Tories. If they're now utterly convinced that Labour's going to win by a mile, they might, because of Gaza or climate change, or whatever, they might decide to vote Green or Lib Dem because it's safe. We'll still get an anti-Tory government. Now, I part company with some of my polling colleagues because a lot of pollsters will say there's little or no evidence of any influence. It seems to me one has got to accept head on that all kinds of information in an election is capable of causing people to change their minds. It might be a manifesto, it might be a newspaper, it might be a politician. I'm not so sure about them having much influence, but so So what I would say is not that polls have no influence. They may very well have an influence, but I would say that of the various impulses, information, or whatever, reaching voters, pollsters are probably about the most honest and reliable of any of the information around. And I was doing a radio debate with George Fowkes, who wants to ban polls in the week or two running up to an election. And so I can see to the point there might be influence. But my proposition would be, if you were to ban polls, then you would have politicians making increasingly outrageous claims about the state of public opinion, and they would be free to do so. And if I, with decent data, were to go public with it, I'd go to jail. Doesn't seem to me a very sensible way. So my view is, and it's the same about having free speech. You've got to take it as it is, warts and all. I would like to see newspapers report polls more responsibly. They're far too willing to blow up a surprise figure into a major headline. And often the reason why the figure is a surprise is because it's a sampling quirk. And it's not really true. Witnessed the other day when YouGov got a lot of publicity for saying Reform had overtaken the Conservatives. It's now fairly clear it didn't. Hasn't at any stage, and probably won't. It was a classic case where the poll was probably a couple of points too high on Reform, a couple of points too low on the Tories, and hey presto, you get Reform at 19%, Tories on 18%, Reform take the lead. But again, that's a free press for you. A free press interacting with statistical wobble in polls and things that are undesirable happen. But what do you do about it?
There's a suggestion, and it was particularly when there was the poll that showed Reform was overtaking the Tories, that if Reform sort of stood down all its candidates and joined forces with the Conservatives might still have a chance of electoral success. To what extent is that true? Is it the case that all these Reform voters would immediately flock back to the Tories, or is it much more complex than that?
Oh, it's not completely true, but it's very largely true. I mean, if we do get a Labour landslide with 37, 38% of the vote, it'll be very precisely because the right of centre vote is split in this election, just as the anti-Tory vote was split in 1983 famously when the Liberal SDP alliance and Labour, both the alliance was 26%, Labour was 28%, and the left was smashed. But let me add one point, because in the 2015 election, when UKIP got 13%, then Farage's party, that didn't actually matter very much. And the reason is that UKIP got its votes from all over the place. There's a quite stark number, a significant number of people who voted Lib Dem in 2010, who voted UKIP in 2015. You think, hang on, what is the possibly in common between the Lib Dem and UKIP? Is this in common? They're both anti-establishment parties, or at least the Lib Dems were an anti-establishment party in 2010, went into government, and so that part of the Lib Dem vote in 2010, which is primarily anti-establishment, looked for another anti-establishment party to support, and that was UKIP. So UKIP got its support from all over the place, therefore it didn't make much difference to the other parties in terms of the election outcome. Reform is very different. In all the polling, it's very consistent. Of the people who are now saying Reform, who voted in the last election, more than 80% of them voted Conservative, and about 6 or 7% of them voted for the Brexit party, and most of the rest didn't vote in the last election. Very tiny numbers of Labour and Lib Dem. So Reform is hurting the Tories in a way that UKIP never did in 2015. Now, if Reform were to stand down, I think most of that would go back. If Reform were to stand down with Farage saying, as he did in 2019 in many seats, we back the Tories to do the best thing for the country. Not everybody, but enough of Reform voters would go back to the Tories. And that would easily, I pluck a number out of the air, but we're talking about maybe 50 or 60 seats that would stay Tory, that in present circumstances will go Labour. Reform really are punishing the Tories. But then, hey, isn't that what Farage wants to do? And that is why he isn't going to drop out. He really, really, really does want to destroy the Tory party.
What's his strategy after the election? Assuming he gets elected in Clacton.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he'll be elected in Clacton. I think it's likely that Richard Tice will. I'm not sure about how many others, because my own guess, and I may be completely wrong, my own guess is I think the reform vote will get squeezed in the final week. Some people will go back to the Tories faced with the actual choice of helping to elect a Labour government. I think that the first thing will be who the Tories elect as their leader. And Farage, I'm thinking as well logically, I had no contact with Farage, needless to say. If the Tories elect, say, Suella Braverman, a pro-reform Tory leader, then you can imagine negotiations taking place and some concord that. It may be a bit like the Liberals and the SDP in the sense of it'll happen, but that was actually, for those who lived through it, it was actually quite messy for a number of months because you're dealing with a lot of petty local jealousies who fight in what seat and so on. It's not a simple business, but there'll probably be some sort of arrangement. But if they Tories elect a leader who says, "I'm going to fight reform, we're going to see reform off," then it'll be a Parliament's long battle with reform trying in by-elections and local elections and so on to try and seek to replace the Tories, also weaken them. That the next election works out very differently. So my answer to your question is, I think Farage's strategy depends on how the Tory leadership battle unfolds this autumn.
Thanks so much, Peter. And that's the show. Thanks to Zoe.
Thank you.
Raf.
Thank you.
And our guest today, Peter Kellner.
Pleasure, I've enjoyed it.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a hearty salute to our generous supporters, without whom we couldn't keep making podcasts. It's as simple as that. So why not join them for as little as £3 a month and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.
Thanks to Donna Pello, Polly Eccleston, Lynn, Olga Dillon and Sarah.
And it's thanks from me to Anne Sutherland, Archie and Pi Vavasaur, Detrimental Arithmetic. That's a fantastic name. Although I'm not even going to pursue what that actually might signify. Thank you, Pete McCaig, and someone whose first name is JFDTJBF. And we can't pronounce the rest. But so thank you. Your support is very much appreciated. Your absence of vowels, less so.
And so much appreciation to Maureen McCulloch, Isabel Colhoun, Alex S., Sue Giles, and returning supporter. Welcome back, Dom Graham.